I'm here at the ARC conference with Toby Young of the Free Speech Union. Toby, nice to see you.
Good to see you, Andrew.
What do you make of this then?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I've only seen a morning's worth of speakers, but they're clearly trying to work out what a more inspiring alternative narrative to the kind of woke, decolonization, white privilege narrative should be, that gives people a bit of hope. They realize they're not going to win that battle in the marketplace of ideas unless they have a fully fledged, well worked out alternative political philosophy to the social justice warriors. They haven't yet worked out exactly what that is. Should it be something like Christianity? That seems to be one of the themes running through the talks I've heard. But they realize that alone is not enough. That's not really going to do the job they want of winning young people's hearts and minds in this kind of great civilizational struggle. But I think the fact that they haven't yet worked out exactly what that political philosophy is shouldn't be held against them. Part of the reason for this conference is to try and work it out together. So they keep talking about the need to tell a better story. Now, the story that appears to be prevailing at the moment is Western civilization is essentially toxic and needs to be dismantled. Yes. And we need to start from scratch. And that's a horrible story to tell. That's a horrible story.
But is it the case that you need a religious story to counter that? Do you need the story of Jesus? Or could it be the story that I think we should be telling, which is, let's get back to liberal values. You know, the idea of free speech, the idea of individual freedoms. Yes. You know, I think that's a good story. Yeah. But is that the one that's being promoted?
Well, most of the speakers, I think, do believe in liberal values. We heard from John Anderson, the former Prime Minister of Australia, admittedly a Conservative Prime Minister, but a classical liberal as well. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, also seemingly a classical liberal, advocating for values like representative government, limited state, free speech. A lot of them have been talking about free speech. It's been encouraging to hear that. They're pretty focused on what they think the critical Western values are that we need to defend from their enemies, both internally and abroad. Yes. But they're not quite clear on what foundation you can base those values. Right. In the absence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, if we discard that as too controversial, as too metaphysical, can we base those sorts of values on reason alone, like some of the enlightened philosophers believe? Yes. Or do we need something more than that? Why are we losing the argument?
So that's very interesting. Is there a basic human need to attach oneself to some kind of grand narrative, some kind of meta-narrative? I mean, I can't help but notice that the new atheists, a lot of those people who were so adamant about the death of God, etc., they have now wholly bought into gender identity ideology in a really militant way. You know, they cast out Richard Dawkins because he raised a question about it. Yes. They're some of the worst when it comes to this. And that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting moments this morning was when Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was very much associated with the new atheist movement, put a bit of distance between herself and that movement. She described it as a wrong turn. They were having the wrong argument. It's not about whether God exists or not, or whether you can prove whether God exists. It's about defending Judeo-Christian values. Right. And you don't have to, she thought, you don't have to appeal to the existence of a supernatural being in order to defend those values. She said that one of the things which made the Judeo-Christian tradition superior to the Muslim tradition, which is the tradition she left behind, she's effectively an apostate, is that it celebrates life. Whereas the tradition she left behind, she described as a death cult. It celebrates death.
But that's what Hamas says explicitly. You know, we love death more than you love life.
Yes.
So it's actually, you know, they would agree.
Well, Hamas would agree, but I'm sure many Muslims would not agree.
I'm sure. Oh, yes, of course. I'm not conflating the two.
No, of course not. Values like individualism, the idea that each individual has a divine spark and therefore is entitled to dignity and rights and the sanctity of life, those sorts of values. Do you need to be brought up in a Christian or Jewish tradition in order to celebrate those values? I don't think you do, but I think you're right. I think young people in particular do need a grand narrative, something in which these values can be contextualized and make sense, which would enable them to defend their values from the attacks on them from all sides.
So a lot of my friends who were once liberals have now said that liberalism has failed. The last couple of weeks, we've seen good examples of this. They say that the fact that we are so open and tolerant leads to extremists on the streets calling for jihad or openly expressing anti-Semitic views, which of course I abhor. And they would say, well, actually, that's liberalism for you, that's what you get, and actually we need to take a stand, be a bit more aggressive. I know Douglas Murray has talked about kicking people out who support that kind of thing. So,
well, I remember when I was a graduate student studying political philosophy and studying communitarianism, one of the great criticisms of liberalism made by the communitarians, they now call themselves post-liberals, is that liberalism wants to be too neutral with respect to various different definitions of the good. They effectively defend a framework within which people can pursue their own good in their own way. They're like what J.S. Mill described as gardeners, cultivating a garden in which many flowers can bloom. The communitarian critique was, no, you need to give people more than that. You need to say what you think is a good life and why people should pursue that life and not another life. It's not enough to be neutral and just defend the framework. That's too fragile, that's too anemic. It doesn't get people's blood flowing. They need something they can glom onto with a bit more power and force and something a bit more enchanting and bewitching than just the kind of disenchanted liberal framework.
But I've always been of, I suppose I have a faith in humanity, but I've always been of the belief that the marketplace ideas is a great thing. You know, most people are generally good, but I think my faith in that is starting to be shaken a little bit by just what I've seen over the past few weeks, for one thing.
I mean, I think one thing that's been really made clear over the past few weeks is that there are large sections of the populations in Western liberal democracies, here, European countries, America, who don't believe in liberal values. They don't really see anything wrong with what Hamas did on October 7th, which is pretty shocking to people like me and you who do believe in the sanctity of human life and do believe that people's rights should be protected, should be defended. There was a poll, I don't know how reliable it is, but there was a poll which was circulated on X, which showed that amongst under 25-year-old Americans, a small majority, but nevertheless a majority thought what Hamas did on October 7th was justified in the circumstances.
I can't even comprehend that.
And so we clearly do have a problem.
Yeah.
There are vast swathes of people, not the majority overall, but perhaps the majority of young people who don't understand why we should be fighting terrorism, why we should be defending liberal democracy, free speech, the right to life and property. So we've got a job on our hands. So ARC may not have the answer, but at least they've correctly diagnosed the problem.
But coming from a free speech perspective as you do, where do you stand on that? People calling for jihad, people basically calling for our liberal values to be torn down, people who don't believe in liberalism, in other words. But there's a complication there, because don't they also have the right to express that view?
Yes, I mean, I think for defenders of free speech, the last couple of weeks have posed some real problems. And we've seen a few kind of fail the test and call for, people who are calling for jihad on our streets to be deported. I certainly wouldn't go that far. I mean, my rule would be the same rule enunciated by the US Supreme Court, which is that speech, broadly speaking, should be permitted unless it's likely to lead to imminent lawless violence.
So the Brandenburg test.
The Brandenburg case, Brandenburg versus Ohio. And so, on that's the basis on which you defend, neo-Nazis marching through Jewish areas.
As the ACLU used to do.
As the ACLU used to do.
And would definitely not today.
And I think they would distinguish between, if a mob, chanting for jihad, point to, a Jewish shop and say, let's burn the shop, then that shouldn't be permitted. That is imminent lawless violence. You can legitimately stop someone from chanting that, punish them if they do. But if they're just saying it more generally, if they're not targeting an individual or somebody's property in the immediate vicinity, then it should be permitted. I mean, that's a pretty liberal standard, but I think to resort from that standard, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. The way I look at it, Andrew, is let's suppose Jeremy Corbyn had won the same majority Boris Johnson won in 2019 and was now offering financial and military support to Hamas in Gaza. We'd want to be out on the streets protesting, and we wouldn't want to be arrested, for standing up for the values we believe in and for saying what we think is right. So I think you have to grant these protesters a degree of latitude. Supporting prescribed terrorist organizations is against the law. The Free Speech Union doesn't defend unlawful speech, and I think in some cases that does constitute unlawful speech. One thing we do disagree with, we've taken a firm line on, is that the police don't need more powers. The police have, if they want to arrest people shouting jihad, chanting the river from the sea, waving Islamic State flags and so forth. They have the power to do that. They don't need more powers. That's an excuse. Right. So we don't want to see police acquiring draconian new powers to suppress protests, to interfere with free speech as a result of these very unpalatable, ugly protests that are taking place.
Well, that's always the risk, isn't it? You get sort of pushed into authoritarianism because of the sheer unpleasantness of the kind of things you're hearing.
Yes. I mean, they are unpleasant, and me and some other people started the British Friends of Israel, and we produced the October Declaration and got many members of the establishment, some celebrated artists, writers, intellectuals, academics, Richard Dawkins, Tom Stoppard, Lord Frost, who's here today, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, 2 ex-PMs, and we've encouraged anyone who wants to sign it, and it's essentially saying, we stand with British Jews, we don't tolerate any anti-Semitic language or activities expressed against British Jews.
Yes.
They should be safe in this country. They should feel safe sending their children to school in this country. And we also condemn anti-Semitism in the Middle East and around the world. And we want the BBC to call Hamas what it is, a terrorist organization. Stop calling them militants or fighters.
Yes.
Call them what they are. So we're definitely standing with Israel, standing with British Jews, and so far 65,000 people have signed it. And if anyone watching this wants to sign it, wants to express their solidarity with British Jews, who I think are feeling pretty beleaguered and isolated at the moment, as though they're not getting enough support, maybe from the government, but not from elsewhere. Yeah. They want to sign it, go to britishfriendsofisrael.org, and anyone can sign. We'll send you a verification email as soon as we get your signature.
Fabulous. Okay, thanks Toby, really appreciate talking to you.
Thanks Andrew.
Thanks.